Thank you, Mario. What an incredible introduction. I'm tempted to say absolutely nothing in response and let it rest at that. It is great to be with so many friends. It is wonderful to be here with you. What an uplifting experience to hear voices raised for freedom. The leaders that this community has had for so many years in Congress, Lincoln, Ileana, Mario, in the Senate, as Marco was walking through, Marco, he said, first you have one Cuban, then you have two Cubans, then you have three Cubans. When he got to four, I could have sworn he was going to say, and then we have a game of dominoes. Which means we need another one. We need another one. When Marco started here in Florida, he was at 3% in the polls. In Texas, when we started, I was at 2% in the polls. So we just need to find someone at 1% in the polls. There's clearly a pattern playing out here. Night before last, we were in the Senate for a fairly late evening, for a filibuster that lasted nearly 13 hours. And as the evening stretched on, I had the opportunity to do a number of things. One, read Travis's letter from the Alamo, which as a Texan was a particular privilege. To read the opening speech from Patton, given by George C. Scott, and to read Ronald Reagan's 1964 speech, A Time for Choosing. Many of you will remember in that speech when Ronald Reagan talked about he had two friends who recently met with a businessman who had fled from Cuba. And the two friends looked to each other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban looked at him and said, "How lucky you are. I had a place to escape to." And as I read those words from that speech in 1964, I looked over 2 seats to my left at the junior senator from Florida who was sitting next to me and remarked what a privilege it was to have a time to stand for liberty when we know precisely how fragile and precious it is. I'll tell you, when I was growing up as a kid, my father, who had been imprisoned, who had been tortured in Cuba, who had come to Texas with nothing. My dad came to Texas in 1957. He was 18. Couldn't speak English, had $100 sewn into his underwear. They don't actually advise carrying money in your underwear. But he washed dishes making 50 cents an hour, pay his way through school. And when I was a kid, my father over and over again conveyed the very same message Ronald Reagan conveyed in that speech. He said, when we lost our freedom in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? So I will tell you, it is so uplifting to be in this room with each of you. In particular, I want to take a moment to recognize the men and women in this room who yourselves fled Cuba seeking freedom. I want to recognize each of the men and women in this room who made that perilous journey. And if I could presume for one moment to speak on behalf of your children, I want to say one thing: thank you. Thank you for that courage. I will tell you, it is an incredible blessing to be the child of an immigrant who fled oppression and came here seeking freedom. Because your children, we understand just how precious and fragile liberty is. That the extraordinary freedom we enjoy in the United States, it's not guaranteed it will remain forever. And so I thank you for that courage and that love of liberty that you have instilled in your children. You know, I'll tell you a story. Some years ago, my aunt, my father's kid sister, returned to Cuba to visit some extended family. And she herself had been imprisoned and had been tortured by Castro's goons. And going back and bringing food and medicine to family there, she went with my cousin, her daughter, Bibi, and she was showing Bibi all around where she had grown up. My aunt told me a story of running into an old friend of hers she had known when she was a little girl. And she went and visited with him and went into his house. And he was working as a mid-level government official. And he had a picture of Fidel Castro on the wall. She said this old friend of hers, who she hadn't seen in 50 years, he took her into the kitchen in the center of the house and he closed all the curtains so that it was shut off from everything around. And this man looked at her and began weeping, weeping uncontrollably. He said, "You know, Sonia, I look at your daughter, Beatriz. I look at the vivaciousness, the joy that sparkles in her eye. And Bibi is your typical fiery Cubana." He said, "I look at her and I see the love of life she has. And I realize she has it because you had the courage to get out of here. You had the courage to escape. And I look at my own children and think of the misery that I have consigned them to because I didn't have the courage to do what you did." And Tia Sonia said he wept for 10 minutes, just uncontrollably, holding his head in his hands. And then he stopped, and he went to the sink, and he cleaned his face, and he opened the windows again and began smiling. That's what the men and women in this room understand. Freedom is precious. These aren't games. You know, this week, Hugo Chavez went to meet his maker. And sometime, hopefully not in the far too distant future, Fidel Castro and Raul Castro will join Hugo Chavez. And all three will face the ultimate judgment. When that occurs, there will be no time when U.S. leadership is more important. The greatest American leader of modern times, in my view, was unquestionably Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan understood something, that the United States has a unique role in the world to speak the truth and to champion freedom. When Ronald Reagan stood up and called the Soviet Union an evil empire, the nattering nabobs at the State Department repeatedly crossed that out of his speech. And each time he wrote it back. When Ronald Reagan said, "Marxism will end up on the ash heap of history," all of the intelligentsia, the media, everyone who knew better said, "What a crazy cowboy. How dare you say such a thing?" And then Reagan uttered the most important words uttered by a leader in modern times. When he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We need that kind of leadership from America. You listen to the political prisoners, you listen to Solzhenitsyn, you listen to those who suffered the gulags, and they passed from cell to cell. Did you hear what President Reagan said? Did you hear what Jeane Kirkpatrick said? Did you hear about the United States telling the truth? And let me tell you what we need right now more than anything with regards to Cuba is leadership in the United States that will tell the truth. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara are not cute, chic icons of Hollywood. They were and are murderous, oppressive thugs. As Chavez has passed away, the United States has not stepped up as it should, speaking about that legacy. And I have to say, it leads me to think, all of us hope, all of us pray, that at the very least, when the Castros go to meet final judgment, that Cuba will be free again. And yet you look at the leadership right now. Let me suggest something simple. We need a president who will stand up today and say, Mr. Castro, let the Cuban people go. Mr. Castro, open up the ballot box. Mr. Castro, empty the jails. Mr. Castro, allow free speech and let freedom blossom. That's the kind of leadership we need right now. I don't know if we're going to get it, but I can say one thing: I have no doubt that the men and women in this room are going to provide precisely that clarion voice of truth. And so again, on behalf of your children, thank you. Thank you for speaking for liberty, and it's an honor to be among you.